With me in the studio today is the world-renowned international relations professor John Mearsheimer. In recent years, he has gone from being an esteemed member of the Academy to something of a renegade icon, saying politically unacceptable things about the war in Ukraine, Israel, potential standoffs in China, and the rest. With his permission, we're going to try and take advantage of his presence here in the studio to ask a big question. Is realism, the school of foreign policy that Professor Mearsheimer is world famous for, winning the argument? What does realism actually mean? You hear it bandied about quite a lot these days, but what does it actually mean, and how does it apply to China, to the Middle East conflicts, and to Ukraine? Most pressingly, are either of the candidates for president realists? Or are they both to some degree? So will we find out in 2 weeks' time that in some way we're all realists now? So at the end of this hour, what I want is that you, the audience, will be able to know to what extent you yourself find yourself a realist in your worldview, and to be able to use that term with confidence when arguing with friends or non-friends over dinner. Professor Mearsheimer, welcome back to Unheard.
Glad to be here, Freddie.
So as I said there, we're hoping for a little bit of a tutorial during this session. I hope that's okay. Let's start with the big question. What is realism in international relations?
Realism is a theory of international politics. It's a theory about how the world works that says that states care more than anything else about the balance of power. This is not to say they don't have other interests. It's not to say that states sometimes can't behave in idealistic ways. But when push comes to shove, it's the balance of power that matters the most to states. And states want to make sure that they have lots of power and that their potential adversaries have as little power as possible. And the principal reason for this is because in the international system, there is no higher authority. There's no ultimate arbiter. There's no Leviathan that can come to the rescue of states if they get into trouble. If you are a state and you're weak and a more powerful state comes after you, you can't turn to a higher authority to rescue you because there is no higher authority. The system is not hierarchic. It's anarchic in the sense that it's flat. And in a world like that, you have to take care of yourself. It's what we call in international relations lingo, it's a self-help world. And what you want to do in that self-help world is be as powerful as possible, because if you're really powerful, it's highly unlikely that anyone will attack you. Now, what this means in terms of liberal values, in terms of idealism, is that there are going to be cases where an idealistic policy lines up with a realist policy. Defeating Adolf Hitler in World War II makes sense from a strategic point of view, from a realist point of view. There's no question about that. The United States does not want Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich to dominate Europe for good realist reasons. At the same reason, it makes perfect sense from a liberal point of view or from an idealistic point of view to want to defeat Adolf Hitler for reasons I don't have to explain to you. So in that case, right, the two approaches go together. The question is, what happens when the arrows point in different directions? And realism calls for pursuing a ruthless foreign policy, and liberalism does not. Which of the two approaches wins out? And the answer from a realist point of view is that realism would dominate. And the reason is because realism is really all about survival. Realism is predicated on the assumption that survival is the highest goal that a state can have. And therefore, if survival is the highest goal, that means realism will trump idealistic logic. And by the way, Freddie, it will also trump economic logic if the two are in conflict. And just to give you a good example that highlights this, that really, I think, illustrates what realism is all about. Once China becomes a great power, we're talking roughly 2017, and it is seen by the United States as a peer competitor. The United States has a vested interest in making sure that it has much more power than China has. The United States wants to check the growth of China as a great power and accelerate its own growth so that the power gap between the two countries is as great as possible in favor of the Americans. But what this means is that the United States is going to have to pursue economic policies that are going to hurt the United States economically. A lot of people say to me, John, if we get tough with the Chinese, as we are now doing economically, it's going to damage the United States. It's going to hurt the American economy. It's going to slow down American economic growth. My response to that is, that's true. But that's the price you have to pay to make sure that you can contain China. So you see the economic arrow and the realist arrow are pointing in opposite directions.
So is it an amoral school? Is it that you are observing the way the world actually works and that there is merit in being truthful and realistic in observing those dynamics? Or do realists actually think there is moral value in survival and your first duty is to your own citizens and therefore it is kind of morally acceptable to pursue self-interest ruthlessly?
I would make the argument that it is an amoral, and very important to emphasize, I'm not saying immoral. It is an amoral theory. And we all have moral compasses in our head, and those moral compasses influence how we think about the world just the way realism does. And as I said, when they're in conflict, the realist compass, so to speak, dominates the moral compass. But realism by itself, in my opinion, is an amoral theory. Now, some people argue that it's not, and you were going down this road, which is not to say you believe this, but one could argue that survival is the highest goal of a state, and it is a virtuous or morally correct goal. And therefore, anything you do to enhance your survival is morally correct. I think if you make that argument, a great power can go out and behave in the most incredibly ruthless ways, and you can defend it as morally correct because it is facilitating that great power's survival. And I think if you go down that road, then it's hard to distinguish moral behavior from immoral behavior or ethical from unethical behavior. And I think that's kind of not the way to go.
So it's more a theory of the way the world actually works than any kind of hope of the way the world should work.
Well, it is the way the world works. And my argument is reflected in my most important book, where I lay out my realist theory. It's called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And I think this is a tragic situation. I think the structure of the international system forces great powers especially, whether it's the United States, Germany, Japan, China, the Soviet Union, Russia. It forces great powers to act in ruthless ways. They have no choice, because in a world where there is no higher authority and another state may attack you, you have a vested interest, a profound interest in making sure you're powerful. And sometimes that requires doing ruthless things. And I think this is a tragic situation.
So if those people who started listening are still with us and it hasn't got too theoretical for them, I'm guessing a lot of people might be thinking, I guess maybe I'm a little bit of a realist. A lot of people were very disappointed by the misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, that whole sense of kind of liberal interventionism, this fantasy that we were going to impose democracy all around the world. That was a sort of unrealistic worldview and doesn't feel very popular anymore. And a lot of people are also pretty skeptical about overarching international institutions, such as the UN, having much influence these days. So if you're listening to this and feeling this is beginning to align with my worldview, do you think those kinds of issues are likely to make you a realist with a small r, at least, a civilian realist?
Yeah, I think you're right. What happened here, in my opinion, Freddie, is that when the Cold War ended, and then when the Soviet Union collapses in December of 2001, we move into what is usually called the unipolar moment. And that means there's only one great power on the planet. and that's the United States of America, which is incredibly powerful. And in a very important way, realism gets put in the back closet or gets put on the back burner because there's no more great power competition. The United States does not have to worry about the balance of power because it's so incredibly powerful. So what the United States does during the unipolar moment, because it's a thoroughly liberal state, is it pursues a liberal foreign policy. It's, in the first time in its history, free to put aside realist concerns and behave in a very liberal way. And of course, the British, or Britain, which is another thoroughly liberal country, becomes part of a tag team with the United States, and the British and the Americans run around the world trying to spread liberal values, sometimes at the end of a rifle barrel. And what happened is that we produced one failure after another. This turned out to be a disastrous foreign policy. So what happens in 2017 with the coming of multipolarity, remember, in about 2017, you move from a unipolar world to a realist world. What roughly happens in 2017 is that realism is back for the United States because we're now in a multipolar world. There are great powers out there, China and Russia, to be specific. That's number one. But number two, what happens is that people understand that a liberal foreign policy, what I like to call liberal hegemony, our policy from roughly 2001 to 2017, has been, I think it's fair to say, a colossal failure. So people are much more sympathetic to realism starting in roughly 2017, moving forward, than they were during the unipolar moment. And of course, most people, and this includes people like you, grew up, came of age in the unipolar moment. Mm-hmm. So realism was something that was easy to be critical of, to dismiss during the unipolar moment. And most people in the liberal West were feeling really good about what liberalism could do. It was the Frank Fukuyama view of the world. What Frank said when the Cold War ended is that the future is liberalism. We liberals have the wind at our back, and what's going to happen is the world is going to become increasingly liberal. By 2017, that line of argument was not looking good. And today, that line of argument is in complete tatters. And when liberalism fails like that, and when you have two other great powers in the system, China and Russia, realism is going to make a comeback. And that's what we see happening here. So people are more sympathetic to realism for sure than they were in, let's say, 2000 or 2010.
Let's try and get specific with some of this, because so far it might seem quite an uncontroversial set of statements that you've made. I think most people would sign up to the failures of that kind of liberal way of thinking during those years. But in recent concrete examples, what you've been saying has been very controversial. A lot of people have been upset by it. They think it's inappropriate. So there is still a lot of energy in the idealistic or non-realistic worldview. Let's do a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and people can feel if they agree with you when we get specific. Starting, if we could, with China, because I know you have most recently been there. You just came back from a trip earlier this month, is that right?
I did, yes.
So I'm guessing your head is full of thoughts about China. On this example, you take a different view to other people who you've maybe agreed with on other areas such as Ukraine and Israel, and you think it would be in America's interests to have really quite an aggressive vantage point or aggressive posture towards China to prevent its increase in power, to prevent it becoming the hegemon. Talk us through that. What would that actually look like?
Well, let me just start by saying that in the early 2000s, in 2001 in particular, when I published The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and China was not a great power, it was a good 15 plus years away from that, I made the argument that China could not rise peacefully. And the United States, of course, was pursuing a policy of engagement toward China, which was designed to help China grow economically. And my argument at the time was that if China grew economically, it would translate that economic might into military might, and it would try to dominate Asia, East Asia, the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. And the United States, of course, would go to great lengths to try to contain China. Hardly anyone agreed with me in the West. And when I went to China, there were a few people who thought there was a real danger that that would happen, but most people in China thought that it could rise peacefully. So I was a real outlier. I think what's happened since then proves that I was basically right, that you were going to get an intense security competition once China began to grow economically. And again, it gets back to the basic logic that I laid out to you at the start of the show, which is to say that the best way to survive for China in the international system is to be especially powerful. And if you're weak, you suffer what the Chinese suffered between the late 1840s and late 1940s. They call it the century of national humiliation. You never want to be weak in international politics because the other great powers in the system will take advantage of you. So what we see happening today in East Asia is that, number one, China is growing more and more powerful. It's translating that economic might into military might. And it's beginning to talk about dominating Asia. Right? And not only dominating Asia, they're building a blue water navy to project power all over the world. They are in a very important way following in the footsteps of the United States. Now, what is the United States and most of China's neighbors doing? They're very scared. They do not want China to dominate Asia. The United States does not want a peer regional hegemon. So what we're doing, to get to the heart and soul of your question, is we're pursuing a containment strategy against China, right? We're trying to contain China's growth to make sure it doesn't dominate Asia. And that containment strategy has two strands to it, right? One is a military strand and the other is an economic strand. The military strand is a lot like what happened in the Cold War. The United States is creating an alliance structure in East Asia that is designed to work with countries like Japan, the Philippines, and so forth and so on, to contain Chinese military power, to make sure China doesn't militarily dominate the region, much the way we worked to prevent the Soviet Union from dominating Eurasia in the Cold War. That's strand number one. The other strand is an economic strand, and it has to do with cutting-edge technologies. The United States lives in mortal fear that China, because it has all of this terribly impressive human capital, is going to be able to dominate the United States when it comes to developing cutting-edge technologies. And that matters greatly for producing wealth, number one. And number two, it matters greatly for the military weaponry that you develop. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we win the race to develop sophisticated new technologies over time. So you see this military competition, which is all about containment, and you see this economic competition that is all about cutting-edge technologies that's all designed to contain China and allow the United States to remain the only regional hegemon on the planet.
But is that a good strategy? Because you're roughly describing what the United States government is currently trying to do. Are you saying that that's the right approach? Because there will be people watching who think this is more getting towards warmongering. This is all being driven by people who want big defense contracts and military spending and so on, and might be very worried about that and feel like we should be stepping back from competing in Asia and it's not even anywhere near us and we should leave it alone. But are you saying that's wrong and that the US should be pursuing this quite aggressive containment strategy?
I am saying it's wrong, that I think if China dominated Asia and had a blue water navy that had significant power projection capability all around the world, that would not be good for the United States. And I think we have a deep-seated interest in containing China. I think this is a tragic situation. I'm not enthusiastic about it all. I've been to China many times. I love going to China. I love the Chinese people. And in fact, I'm more at home intellectually in China than I am in the West, because the Chinese are basically realists, whereas in the West, people are instinctively liberal, and they instinctively don't like realism because it's such a pessimistic way of thinking about the world. So,
So did you say all this in China in recent weeks?
Oh, sure.
And you felt comfortable doing that?
Oh, sure.
They're not going to...
I didn't say it this time, but in past years when I've gone to China, I've often started my talks by saying, it's good to be back among my people. I don't speak a word of Chinese, and I feel like I'm a fish out of water culturally, when I'm in China. But intellectually, the Chinese are my kind of people. They're realists, very interested in theory. I've never gone to any country where people are more interested in international relations theory and talking about the big issues.
But did you say to them that you think it's right that the U.S. is containing them?
Oh, yes.
And they feel, how do they respond to that?
Well, let me make it clear. I also say to the Chinese, I think they should try to dominate Asia. I say if I was the national security advisor in Beijing, I would want to dominate Asia. One of my principal goals would be to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain, push the Americans out beyond the second island chain, and get the Americans out of East Asia. And then I do everything I can to maximize the power gap between China and Japan, China and India, and so forth and so on.
This is going to make some people a bit uncomfortable if they are now not exactly an enemy, but a non-friendly power at this point. To have an esteemed American professor going and giving them tips on how better to expel the Americans from their sphere of influence, a lot of Americans might be a bit uncomfortable hearing that.
They may, but I've been saying this for a long time, and I don't think, to be honest, the Chinese need me to tell them that this is what they should do, any more than the Americans needed me after 1783 to tell them what to do. My argument is the structure tells states basically what to do, and the Chinese long ago figured out that you want to be the most powerful state in Asia. But at the same time, I believe the United States should go to great lengths to check China. Now, the Chinese actually, I believe, like me very much, in good part because I tell them that the United States is a ruthless great power. And I do believe the United States is a ruthless great power. I do believe the United States is deeply committed to checking their rise. And the Chinese will say that most Americans who come through say the United States is a benign great power, that the United States and China can get along, but you, John, come in and tell the truth. You admit that the United States, your country, is a ruthless great power, to which my response is that's correct, because great powers are ruthless by definition. And the fact that great powers are ruthless is why you have to go to such great lengths to make sure your great power, the state that you live in, is very powerful. Because if you live in a great power that's weak, other powers will prey on you.
So if you're observing this potential future clash where it is in China's interests to dominate East Asia and it is in America's interest to prevent that happening, who do you expect to win that clash?
I believe that the United States will succeed in preventing China from dominating East Asia and becoming a peer regional hegemon. So I think that's true.
How will they achieve that?
The United States is remarkably powerful. It has lots of nuclear weapons, and it has a good number of allies in East Asia who will help the United States in that endeavor.
Up to and including war? For example, Taiwan is the most talked about flashpoint. Do you think it will come to actual conflict? And you think the US will prevail in that conflict?
Well, I think this is the key issue, Freddie. That's what concerns me. It's not so much who wins in the end, because I think that's far off, and I'll be long gone from the planet by the time that one is decided, in all likelihood. I think the much more interesting question is the one you raise, which is how likely it is that we'll have a war. And you want to remember, when you talk about a war between the United States and China, you're talking about a war between two nuclear-armed great powers, and the potential for escalation is always there, and we could, end up incinerating each other. So this is really serious business. And I think the key question moving forward is is whether this will evolve the way the Cold War evolved. During the Cold War, we had a number of major crises, various crises over Berlin, and most importantly, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But thankfully, in all those crises in the Cold War, cooler heads prevailed, and we did not have a shooting war. And I just hope that moving forward, that is the case with regard to the United States and China. But my point is that this security competition is already present. And it's in the South China Sea, not so much over Taiwan these days, where you can see the two sides maneuvering with each other and where there's real potential for conflict, I think. And I just hope that if we have a major crisis somewhere down the road, that cooler heads will prevail on both sides.
And so if a Chinese senior military person was sitting in one of your lectures in China in recent weeks and felt inspired that, yes, John Mearsheimer is right, we need to push ahead with making sure that we get regional domination. We're going to take a risk. We're going to have an actual standoff with the US in the South China Sea or in Taiwan. Would you support the US fighting back with weapons, with guns, with bombs to push that back and allow a real conflict to take place?
Yeah, I would support it. I mean, the key issue here is Taiwan. And the question is, will the United States fight and die to defend Taiwan if the Chinese were to invade Taiwan? And I think the answer is yes. I think that we would fight and die to defend Taiwan. I think the Japanese would be with us as well. I hope it doesn't come to that for sure, but I think it is important for the United States to make sure that China does not acquire Taiwan.
And do you think young Americans will enlist to go all the way to Taiwan in such a scenario, to fight and die to protect it? Or do you feel like among the civilian population, there is no longer appetite to take part in those kind of foreign adventures?
Well, I think that should a war break out, should, let's say, China tries to invade Taiwan, the United States will use its existing military forces to enter the fight, right? So we will be in the fight. And I think the question that you're asking is whether or not we'll have to quit the fight because the American public will say, we're not going to fight this war. I think that is, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, extremely unlikely to happen because the government, the U.S. government, will go to great lengths to manipulate the discourse on what is going on in ways that present China as a mortal threat, and therefore give the American public powerful incentives to support the war, to include, participating in the fighting.
Final question on China before we move on our little global tour of great threats. Do you think there's a meaningful difference between a President Harris and a President Trump as regards China and how the US would respond to that kind of aggression? Or do you think the differences are exaggerated and it might be much the same?
I think there's not much difference. I think where there is real differences on Ukraine. But I think with regard to China, you want to remember the president who abandoned engagement with China and moved explicitly to a containment strategy was Donald Trump. Remember, my argument was that it was roughly around 2017 when China became a great power and Russia was resurrected from the dead, and it too became a great power. Trump was the one who explicitly abandoned engagement, which was designed to help China grow economically and to get along with China. And he pursued a containment strategy. And then when Joe Biden became president, he followed in Trump's footsteps. So I think Trump will continue to pursue containment. I think the only meaningful difference between Trump and Harris or Trump and Biden is how Trump deals with allies compared to how Biden has dealt with allies and how Harris is likely to deal with allies. I think Trump tends to be much too rough with allies. He tends to want to slap them around, whereas I think both Biden and Harris are much more interested in working with the allies in a cooperative way. But in terms of basic policy towards China, I just don't see any difference between Harris and Trump.